Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Prime Minister for his statement, and I'm sure I speak for the whole country when I say we're pleased to see that Heathcliff has come home. There are four main issues I want to ask about: the world economy, aid, climate change and Zimbabwe. First, on Zimbabwe, can I congratulate the Prime Minister for putting the issue on the top of the G8 agenda, on sanctions against the regime and on not recognising the legitimacy of the government. Real progress was made, and he is to be congratulated on the role he played in that. The key is now to translate those words at the G8 into an effective UN resolution. Given what the Russian president has said, that a UN resolution hasn't actually been agreed, is he confident that the Security Council will pass a resolution that enforces an arms embargo and meaningful targeted sanctions on members of the regime? Specifically on sanctions, given the EU sanctions target 130 officials, can he tell us why the figure in the draft resolution is just 14? The G8 also calls for the appointment of a UN envoy to Zimbabwe, which again is welcome. Will the Prime Minister now press for his appointment to be accompanied by a UN commission to investigate human rights abuses in Zimbabwe? On Africa more widely, can the Prime Minister give us some further reassurance, he spoke about this, but that the Gleneagles pledges are not being watered down? At Gleneagles, the commitment was to increase development aid by $50 billion by 2010, with $25 billion of that going to Africa. The latest communiqué has a rather tortuous phrase, and I quote, about being firmly committed to working to fulfil our commitments. According to Oxfam, on current trends, rich countries could miss their 2010 promise by as much as $30 billion, money that could save 5 million lives. Given all this, is the Prime Minister really convinced that the Gleneagles pledges will be delivered? Taking one part of this, again which the Prime Minister mentioned, the vital issue of access to HIV/AIDS treatment. Tony Blair said last year that the G8 was still committed to, and I quote, delivering universal access to HIV/AIDS treatments by 2010. I asked Tony Blair repeatedly about interim targets to help make sure the 2010 commitment was kept. Yet now, with just 2 years to go, the G8 says, and I quote, it's working towards the goal of universal access. How close to universal access to these vital treatments does the Prime Minister expect us to actually get to in 2 years' time? Third, on climate change, the Prime Minister said the G8 agreement represented major progress. And on the face of it, the 50% cut in emissions does look good. But isn't it the case that when you look at the small print, isn't it the case there are a series of problems with the goal that was set? First, the goal is for global emissions, not G8 emissions, and yet there are no figures for the contributions that G8 countries should make. Next, the declaration, which the Prime Minister mentioned, issued by the wider group of economies that met on Wednesday, isn't it the case that that had no specific figures at all? Furthermore, while the 2050 goal is clearly 42 years away, there are no interim targets. And vitally, isn't it the case, although there does seem to be some uncertainty here, that the 2050 goal itself is not being measured against 1990 levels, as we've always discussed before, but actually against current levels? Could he confirm that? Taken together, don't these points demonstrate that progress has been painfully slow? The fourth issue is the world economy. As the Prime Minister said, one of the keys to improving standards of living is to break down barriers to trade, and the G8 said it would continue to work as a matter of urgency on the Doha negotiations. Isn't it the case that the greatest contribution that the EU could make is to reform the Common Agricultural Policy? Now, the Prime Minister told the Liaison Committee last week that he wanted to see the CAP change, and I quote, fundamentally. Wouldn't that have been much easier if the government hadn't abandoned much of our rebate without any guarantee of real CAP reform in return? At a time when people face higher food prices, higher fuel bills and a credit crunch, what they need is a government that is on their side and able to help. The Prime Minister talks a lot about global oil markets, and clearly these are important issues. But isn't there something he could do in the UK to help people who need a car to get to work? First, why doesn't he scrap his retrospective VED tax hike for next year? Will he at least admit that when he told me from that dispatch box that a majority of drivers would benefit, that he was wrong? Will he now correct himself and apologise to the House for getting it wrong? Second, will he look at our proposal for a fair fuel stabiliser? People want to know the outcome of the G8 is going to help people in this country. Isn't it the case that when the Prime Minister... Could he look at our proposal for a fair fuel stabiliser, so when the price of oil rises, the government actually shares the pain with the motorist? Isn't it the case that when the Prime Minister looks at other G8 countries, far from being the best prepared for global economic uncertainty, Britain is amongst the worst? In France and the United States, they are cutting taxes to boost people's living standards. He can't do that, as he's given us the biggest budget deficit, not only out of the G8 countries, but out of all the 55 large economies, apart from Hungary, Egypt and Pakistan. Isn't that the true situation? Isn't that why, in spite of all the difficulties people face, he is actually planning to put up taxes next year and the year after? Of course, people welcome the positive reports he's given on developments at the G8, but aren't they entitled to something else? Isn't it time the Prime Minister, who for years boasted about an end to boom to bust, about prudence and about stability, told us why, as the difficult years come, he put nothing aside during the good years to help people when they needed it?